You know what's so interesting, yeah, is that the conversation of critical race theory is always don't call it critical race theory, just call it history, right? We just want comprehensive history. But it's so interesting to me that by and large, what you just said will never enter into their definition of comprehensive history. It's always going to be 1619-esque, Jamestown-esque, if you will, kind
Right.
of revisionist history. They're never going to insert these other moments that undermine the narrative of what America actually was, which was a complicated story. I mean, to say the least, it wasn't clear cut. It wasn't. It wasn't good. It wasn't bad. In times it was good. In times it was bad. It was both, and all of these things. So I think this interesting dynamic of history should be taught, but unfortunately, that's not what it seems that people really want. So
Yeah.
I want to step back just for a moment, and then we can revisit Thanksgiving just a little bit because I have some questions about that. But I think this is important for my audience to know too about Squanto. Is Squanto knew English, and if I'm not mistaken, Squanto knew English because he was actually rescued by Christian monks. So could you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if you back up to when Jamestown is a colony, one of the things that happens early on in Jamestown days, there's other explorers who are sailing up and down the coast. And actually, this is one of the reasons that there were often bad relationships between the people of Jamestown and the natives. At times, there were certain tribes they got along with, but generally speaking, they didn't always have the most godly behavior. And so obviously, when you're treating people in an ungodly manner, it doesn't encourage them to be your good friend.
Right.
So one of the things that happened is there was a Captain Thomas Hunt who was on a exploring expedition, and he got off, and there were a group of natives, and he essentially kidnaps these natives and took them over to England to sell, or back to Europe to sell. And when they got to Europe to sell, and I think there were 27 of them is my recollection. And actually, we can look that up. It's a very well-known number. And
Yeah,
I didn't look this
it's
story
not
up before we
relevant.
talk. So right. Take this number loosely, but I think it was 27 natives that were initially taken back over to Europe. And what happened is they were put on the slave trading blocks because the slave trade was a real thing back then. And so these natives put on a slave trade block, and there were some friars who saw them, right? Some Christian friars who saw these natives being sold. And so they went and some of the natives already been sold, but they went and bought every single one they could. And they bought the majority of the natives, and they brought them back to live with them at their monastery. And on the monastery, they actually taught them how to speak English. They took care of them. They fed them. And that's where Squanto was for several years in 1619. And there's a lot of provenance to this story because Squanto's tribe was actually the ones that lived the area where the pilgrims, their ship landed and where they set up their first colony. So Squanto's tribe, that's actually part of where his tribe used to live. That was part of their land, their possession. So Squanto is over in England, and in 1619 finds a ship that's sailing back to Jamestown. So he gets back to Jamestown and works his way back up to where his people were. When he gets back, he finds out that a disease had come and spread, and it had killed every single member of his tribe. He was the only one who survived. Now, again, there's a lot of God's providence in this story that God would preserve this one individual and in the midst of a terrible situation, right? We know Romans 8:28, that God can cause all things to work together for good for those that love and are called according to his purpose. You can go to the end of Genesis when Joseph tells his brothers, after he's been sold into slavery, he says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. We know that we serve a God who can take bad moments and cause good to come out of bad moments. Squanto going into slavery, I mean, this is really like kind of the story of Joseph in the Bible, right? Like him going into slavery is not a good moment, but in slavery, God rescues him, God protects him, God gives him favor, and he learns English in 1619. He's on a ship, he's coming back to the New World. He lands in the New World, goes home, and realizes everyone, his entire family, his wife, everyone's gone. They all died of this disease. And it's also interesting for the natives back then, they didn't understand disease like we understand disease today. And in fact, nobody back then really understood it the way we do it today, but certainly the natives didn't. And so what they thought was there was an evil spirit on that area. And so the natives said, then we're not going to live here. We're going to leave that land alone, which again is providential because the pilgrims land on an area that the natives have determined to be kind of unclean because of this disease. So the natives are like, we don't want this land. So the pilgrims land there. And when they finally encounter the natives and they say, hey, we want this land, the natives are very willing to sell them the land because like, we don't want to live here. There's, something bad here. And the pilgrims are like, yeah, we're good. We're not worried about that. But Squanto then is the most providential guy that he goes back that the pilgrim ship just happens to land in the area, like just happens, right? This is providence, just happens, quotation marks. The Pilgrim ship lands in the exact area where Squanto's people have been. Squanto comes back, this guy who's been over in England. So nobody in the New World, no native knew the Pilgrim's customs better than Squanto. He's the one guy who can help merge the old world and the new world together and help the Pilgrims learn how to survive. It's an incredible, amazing providential moment in the history of this nation. And it's one of the areas, again, where when we look at history from our organization, because we know there is a God, when we study history, we are very cognizant of God moments like this, where, man, look what God just did in this moment. Look how God used this person. History becomes much more fascinating when you keep God part of the story. One of the challenges with modern history is, right, for most of us growing up in history, it was really like dates and dead people. Yeah. There were no stories involved. The reason that we can read and be fascinated by the story of Joshua or Caleb or David or Paul or Elijah, or like you pick these heroes from the Bible, why we're fascinated with their story is because it tells us their story, but their story includes the God moments in their story. And the story of history it's an inaccurate story if you exclude God, but it's always a much more fascinating story when you recognize the God moments.
100%.
And this is certainly one of those things that when you study the history, especially of the Pilgrims, it's very easy to see the God moments when God showed up and helped them and providentially moved on their behalf or brought them friends and allies along the way. It's one of these overlooked parts of American history that is really one of the most significant foundations to the nation that America became.
You can catch brand new episodes of Indie Thinker with Reed Huberman every Monday and weekly bonus episodes to keep you thinking throughout the week. But you have to subscribe and click the bell to be notified when new episodes drop. If you enjoy this content, make sure to like this video and share it with friends.